long before the first stones of San Lorenzo were lifted from the riverbanks, before colossal heads stared silently across the Gulf Coast lowlands, and before jaguar gods roamed the minds of men, not even a tribe in the formal sense. It was an idea, raw, instinctual, waiting for a shape. The land needed a vessel, a mind to listen to its rhythms, to rise with its floods, and fall with its droughts. It needed a ruler, though no one yet understood what that meant. He was born on a morning when the fog never lifted. The sun was hidden, but the air pulsed with heat. No carvings predicted his fate. But the moment he cried out, a tremor passed beneath the soil, so subtle that only the animals responded. But it was there. The howler monkeys ceased. The river paused its hiss, and a distant rumble echoed beyond the horizon. The villagers would later say the earth remembered his birth. He grew without a name for a time. Names came after survival. His people were riverfolk, hunters, foragers, and part-time cultivators of maize, squash, and beans. They knew the language of fish and jaguar, of thunder and smoke. They knew how to survive but not yet how to build. Structures were temporary, homes made of reeds and mud, built to be destroyed and remade. The boy, still nameless, learned to walk on flooded paths and listen to trees swaying in the wind. He was quiet, eerily so, and rarely cried. He watched, memorized, mimicked. He played with river stones and carved simple patterns with a piece of shell. Spirals, lines, eyes, mouths. The elders noticed, but said nothing. When he was 7, he followed his father into the forest during a hunt. A wild boar was the target, its footprints fresh in the mud. But something strange happened. The boy stopped abruptly near a patch of obsidian-streaked rock. His father urged him forward, but he did not move. Instead, he knelt, placing his hand on the earth. The leaves did not rustle. They were gods of the underworld, messengers of rain and night. To be marked by a jaguar was to walk a thin line between life and death, between creation and destruction. He was given a name at last, cradle, meaning serpent, but he would outgrow it. By the age of 10, he had mapped the stars with bone and charcoal. Not with perfect precision, but with uncanny intuition. He could point to a tree's shadow and tell when the next flood would come. He was never formally taught. Knowledge seemed to cling to him like mist to leaves. When others failed to start fire in the wet season, he conjured flame from damp bark. When the fishing nets failed, he swam alone and returned with fish in his hands. Still, he spoke little. The village grew quiet when he entered. He was not feared, but neither was he loved. 13, his mother drowned. A sudden rise in the river swept through the village in the night. Her body was found wrapped around a branch, eyes open to the sky. He stood at the river's edge for 2 days without food or water, staring where the current had taken her. On the 3rd day, he vanished into the forest. For months, he did not return. The villagers believed him dead. But he had gone deeper than any child dared, beyond the familiar groves and hunting trails, into the true wild, where no fire could last and the air tasted of copper and salt. He wandered until he collapsed beneath the ceiba tree of his birth. There, in a fever dream, he saw the jaguar again, not in flesh, but in smoke and bone. It offered no comfort, only silence. He woke with a scar on his hand in the shape of a claw. He returned to the village taller, changed, his eyes no longer boyish. He spoke of the voice beneath the soil, of the need to build not only for survival but for memory. He claimed that the earth could be shaped, that the floods could be tamed, that water could be guided, not feared. The elders scoffed. The village had stood on its stilted legs for generations. But the young listened. Among them was a girl named Ix Chelna, a watcher of the skies, an apprentice to a priestess long gone. She had studied shadows and stars, but unlike him, she had no gift, only discipline. She believed in numbers, in repetition, in cycles. Yet when she heard him speak of the earth's breath and the river's pulse, she did not dismiss him. She asked him where he had been. He told her. Together they began to watch. The tides, the winds, the migration of birds, the birth of insects, the paths of ants, the crack of branches. They mapped and measured, scratched lines into clay, into bark, into bone. They discovered that the river rose not with anger but with rhythm, that the sun's highest point aligned with certain stones, certain days, that maize sprouted best when the moon passed a particular star. He began to build. Small at first, stone-lined pits for cooking, then raised paths over the floodplain, then clay platforms that resisted the soft soil. The elders mocked, then watched, then followed. In 2 years, the village changed shape. Water no longer swallowed homes. Food became abundant. The people stopped calling him serpent. They called him Ahkuun, he who listens below. But peace is not power. Other villages saw the changes, the rising structures, the strange authority of the boy who bent rivers. Some feared, others envied. A raiding party came one night, burning huts and stealing maize. The people cried for help. Ahkuun rose not with fury, but with clarity. He had no army, no weapons, but he had the land. He collapsed the path beneath the raiders' feet, flooding their exit route with redirected water. He trapped them not with violence, but accepted maize, obsidian, feathers. He wore a headdress of jaguar skin not as a crown, but as memory. He spoke less than ever, but when he did, the forest seemed to lean in. And beneath his feet, the earth waited, not for a boy or a hunter or even a priest, but for a king, because the land remembers those who shape it. The stones remember hands that lift them. And in the breath of the river, there were whispers now, of a city yet unmade, of heads carved from mountains, of gods with human eyes. The world had not seen such a man before, but it would, and his name would be lost. In the years that followed his rise, the boy once called cradle, now whispered as Ahkuun, became a presence both vital and ungraspable. He was no longer merely one of the river folk. He had become something different, something that stirred awe in the young and quiet unease in the old. He was not their ruler in name, yet the people followed his lead. They mimicked the lines he drew in the soil. They echoed the rhythms of his planting cycles. And when disputes arose, they looked to him not for judgment, but for correction, as if he alone could recalibrate the disorder of men the way he had tamed the river's course. But Ahkuun felt no pride in this. He moved through his people not as a king. A jaguar with no pupils and a mouth of stone approached him in total silence and placed its forehead against his. He awoke gasping, with his hand clenched around a fragment of jaguar tooth. "What is calling you?" He gave no answer, only silence, and eyes that had begun to look more and more like carved obsidian. One night, a new phenomenon marked the sky. A blood moon, brighter than any in living memory, rose from the east, casting crimson light upon the wetlands. The villagers gathered in awe. Some sang, others trembled. 9 Chelna traced calculations in the dust, trying to decipher what sign this could mean. But Ahkuun stood alone at the edge of the gathering, staring upward with his jaw clenched. He knew. This was not omen, it was invitation. That night, he returned to the forest, this time with deliberate intent. He walked for hours beyond the mapped lands, beyond the streams and known groves, until the moonlight no longer touched the soil. Though the air outside was still and thick, he entered without hesitation. Inside, time ceased. He descended into a space of dripping stone and echoing silence. The air was heavy with minerals, and the walls pulsed faintly with the moisture of centuries. As he moved forward, the light dimmed until only sound remained, the slow rhythm of droplets falling into shallow pools. Then, another sound, breathing, not his own. The eyes appeared first, gold-ringed, motionless. The jaguar stepped from the blackness without sound, its fur the color of night itself, broken only by the shimmer of muscle beneath it. It was massive, too large for nature, yet too precise for illusion. It stopped an arm's length from him. He knelt not in fear but recognition. The jaguar did not move. His breath was slow, steady. Then it circled him once, brushing its flank against his shoulder. Where it touched, his skin burned with cold. When it returned to face him, its mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Instead, Ahkuun felt a pressure in his skull, a thought that was not his own. "You are not a king," it said, though no words were spoken. "You are a mirror. You are the mouth of stone and the breath of ash. You are the claw beneath the roots. You will build what can be destroyed. You will speak what cannot be heard. And when your blood joins the soil, the earth will rise again." Then it vanished, not in smoke, but in disintegration, falling into dust that glowed briefly before fading. Ahkuun was alone, but the cave no longer felt empty. He emerged at dawn, changed again. His eyes no longer blinked at light. His skin bore a new mark, a line of darkened flesh across his collarbone, like a slash from an unseen claw. The forest greeted him with silence. Back in the village, Ix Chelna saw the mark and said nothing. She merely handed him a shard of stone and gestured to the wet clay wall they used for notations. He pressed the stone into the surface and carved a symbol, a spiral inside a jaguar's jaw, a new glyph, a new language, not for men but for the gods. Over the following months, Ahkuun began to build differently, no longer for function alone, but for permanence. He called for larger stones, heavier platforms. He spoke of aligning buildings with solstices, of sculpting shrines that could contain the sky. The people were confused. Why did paths need to face the sunrise? Why did roofs need to echo thunder? But they obeyed. He created ceremonial plazas, open spaces lined with markers, not altars. The villagers did not understand their purpose until one night during the equinox, when the moonlight passed perfectly between two carved stones and illuminated a pool of water that reflected a single constellation. The jaguar's eye, or replaced doubt. His power deepened, but so did the isolation it brought. Fewer spoke to him directly. Children no longer played in his presence. He had become sacred and therefore separate. Only 9 Chelna remained close, astronomy wrapped in ritual. But not all were content. Among the elders, a whisper grew. Was this boy still one of them? Or had he been claimed by something else? The old priest, once the spiritual head of the village, confronted Ahkuun in the plaza. He accused him of blasphemy, of making symbols not sanctioned by tradition. He called the jaguar a demon, not a god. Ahkuun did not answer. He simply pointed to the sky, where a meteor crossed the heavens and vanished behind the trees. The villagers gasped. The priest fell silent. That night, the old temple caught fire. No one knew how. Some said it was lightning. Others said the gods were choosing. Ahkuun did not rebuild it. He built a circle of stone instead, open to the sky, the center carved with jaguar teeth. He declared it the mouth of time, where earth and star would speak. Ceremonies changed, offerings changed, and when children were born during eclipses, she named them from his glyphs. A new generation was forming, born not of the jungle's chaos, but of its memory. The people began carving. Small at first, masks, then busts, then full heads. They used basalt from the riverbanks, heavy and unyielding. The work was slow but guided by vision. Ahkuun selected one boy, a sculptor's apprentice, to create the first true image. It was not of Ahkuun himself, but of the jaguar. Seated, eternal, its eyes open to the horizon. When it was finished, it was placed not in a temple, but at the center of the plaza, facing the east. The rains came heavier that year, but no floods rose. The river curved around the village as if in deference. Crops flourished. Children thrived. For a time all was aligned. And yet Ahkuun felt the tension mounting. In dreams, the jaguar returned, but it was no longer silent. It growled low, restless. The jungle grew louder at night, as if awakening. The blood moon returned, and with it, an eclipse. 9 Chelna read the signs and grew pale. She said only, "It begins." He nodded. He already knew, because power, once awakened, must be tested. And the earth never gives without taking. The calling had come. The voice beneath the soil was louder now. And it would not be satisfied with symbols or shrines. It wanted stone. It wanted cities. It wanted kings. And it wanted blood. Tales of a boy who spoke with jaguars and bent water to his will moved from one fishing camp to the next, mutating as they spread. Some called him the child of the underworld. Others called him a false god. But all agreed on one thing. He was building something no one had seen before. And that made him dangerous. Ahkuun knew the moment was approaching. Every generation has a trial, and his would not come from the sky or soil. It would come from men. For years, he had walked the line between ruler and oracle, between man and symbol. But power invites challenge, and challenge demands blood. He began preparing not for war, but for fire. The first attack came without warning, under cover of monsoon winds. Blades of chipped obsidian glinting beneath woven cloaks. Their feet were silent on the flood paths, their minds fueled by fear and prophecy. They believed Ahkuun's power lay in his symbols, and if they could destroy the sacred plaza, the rest would fall. But Ahkuun had studied more than stars. He had studied people. He had felt their fear years before it grew into courage. And he had prepared. The raiders stepped onto what seemed to be a dry, elevated path. But as they advanced, the ground softened. Beneath their feet, the mud released with sudden violence. Traps of woven reeds and shifting earth collapsed under their weight, swallowing their legs, their fire, and their screams. By the time they realized it was a trap, it was too late. Ahkuun did not meet them with an army. He walked alone into the mist, his silhouette lit only by the faint glow of burning reeds. Behind him, Ix Chelna stood in the circle of stone, chanting in the ancient meter of the sky. Her voice rose and fell with the wind. The attackers froze at the sight. They had expected walls. They found gods. Ahkuun spared those who surrendered. He fed them as before. But this time he sent them back with more than a warning. He sent them with stories. He let them see the carvings of the jaguar, the great stones dragged from the river's edge and placed with ritual precision. He let them touch the shrines and taste the blessed maize. He let them believe that San Lorenzo was not merely guarded, it was chosen. It was a lesson to all others. Those who tried to destroy would be absorbed. Resistance would be turned into reverence. And yet, Ahkuun knew this was only the beginning. The river of fire and blood had only begun to flow. The following seasons were marked by unrest. Village after village sent envoys, some in peace, some cloaked in threat. They came to understand or to unmake. Ahkuun welcomed them all. He showed them the paths elevated above the floods, the storage pits that held food through dry months, the stone-lined canals that redirected river overflow into sacred pools. Some bowed in wonder, others plodded quietly. Ix Chelna saw the shift first. She warned him that power once shared was no longer power controlled. That influence once exported returned in unpredictable forms. That the glyphs now painted on walls miles away were no longer his. They were becoming myths, distorted, reinterpreted, weaponized. But Ahkuun could not retreat. To pull back was to undo what had been shaped. So he pressed forward. He called together the strongest builders, the keenest minds, and the most loyal of the sculptors. He told them of a plan so vast it seemed mad. A city not just for living but for memory. A city that would outlast time, where even stone would dream. He spoke of plazas that echoed thunder, of causeways aligned with constellations, of monuments that bore the weight of gods and the shape of men. The people, awed and terrified, agreed. Construction began not at the center, but along the edges. New districts were built not for defense, but for observation. Platforms shaped like jaguar paws pointed toward the rising sun. Walls bore spirals that captured sound. Pools were lined with volcanic stone that reflected moonlight with eerie brilliance. Every structure carried meaning. Nothing was arbitrary. And still the attacks came. They were more organized now. Not wild bands, but coalitions, leaders from the east and south, once rival tribes, now allied by their fear of a rising empire. They did not attack blindly. They studied the terrain, learned from past failures. When they struck, they brought fire not to the ground, but to the food stores, the granaries. They sought to starve the spirit, not break the stone. Ahkuun adapted again. He moved the granaries underground. He carved ventilation shafts and secret channels that allowed for airflow and concealment. He used the same strategies that had once shaped water to now shape resistance. Ix Chelna oversaw the construction of the first subterranean shrine, half temple, half fortress. It became a place where prayer and preparation were indistinguishable. In the heart of this chaos, a child was born, not to Ahkuun, but to a weaver's daughter who had once been among the raiders. A storm upstream had dislodged a landslide rich in iron and clay. The water bled across the lowlands like a wounded serpent. The villagers panicked. Some believed it a curse, others a prophecy. These bricks became the foundation for a new plaza, a ring of red that caught the morning light like fire. At its center, a colossal head was placed. It was the first to bear the face of a man. The sculptor who carved it had never seen Ahkuun smile. But as he worked, his hands seemed guided. When the head was unveiled, the people gasped. It bore the features of their ruler, not as he was. Enemies no longer came to destroy, they came to possess. They wanted the symbols, the secrets, the city itself. Armies approached not with fire, but with requests, treaties, proposals for shared governance. The idea of San Lorenzo had grown too powerful to crush. It had to be absorbed, but Ahkuun refused, not out of pride but clarity. A vision once divided decays. A message, once diluted, disappears. He held to his path, though the cost grew higher each year. Ix Chelna saw it in his eyes. The weight, the fatigue, the sorrow of understanding that to be the founder of a world is also to become its prisoner. To birth a city was to bury oneself within it. Still, he pressed on. Because there was no alternative. Because the river kept moving. Because the earth kept speaking. The river of fire and blood was not an enemy. It was a baptism. And from it, San Lorenzo emerged. Not untouched, but unbroken. The stones now bore names. Its paths echoed with chants. Its towers cast shadows that marked the passing of stars. And at its heart, a man stood alone, not as a conqueror, but as a conduit. The jaguar stirred. It began not with a proclamation, nor a conquest, nor a divine thunderclap. It began with a shallow trench cut into wet earth. A single line, traced by a stick carved with jaguar teeth. It cut across the edge of the floodplain like a vein opened deliberately, bleeding intention into mud. Around it stood no temple, no army, no crowd. Only Ahkuun, silent, watching the shadows cast by morning light. Behind him, Ix Chelna recorded the sun's position with a polished disk of obsidian. Her hands steady, her eyes focused on the sky rather than the man. They called it the line of breath. It was the axis upon which everything would turn. Long before the name San Lorenzo would be whispered by archaeologists in far-off tongues. Not a city in the way later empires would understand, with rigid streets and numbered districts. This would be something older, deeper, a reflection of stars in clay. Trees rose like pillars but hid treacherous roots. The Quetzalcoatlus River, generous in rain and cruel in drought, curled around the region like a serpent guarding its hoard. Yet Ahkuun chose this site not in spite of its wildness, but because of it. He claimed the land spoke more clearly here, that its danger was a language, that its resistance was permission. He summoned no labor army, made no speeches. Instead, he knelt beside the first trench and dug. Slowly, deliberately. The villagers who watched did not understand. They saw no value in building where the floods would come, where the soil could not hold weight. But they watched, and when Ix Chelna joined him, measuring, carving glyphs into wooden staves planted at intervals along the line, they came closer. The first platform was small, just enough to raise a person above ankle-deep water. It was made not of stone, but of packed earth and lime, reinforced with basketry and shell fragments. It sank slightly with each rain, but did not collapse. On it, Ahkuun placed a simple altar not to a god but to time. A flat stone with 4 spirals etched into its corners, aligned to the cardinal winds. Then came the causeways. They extended outward like roots, linking the platform to higher ground. These paths were not straight, but curved gently, mimicking the river's rhythm. They were designed not just for travel but for listening. Beneath them, channels were dug to carry floodwaters, lined with clay and palm fiber. These were not drains, they were veins. The city would not fight the flood. It would breathe with it. As the structure grew, so too did understanding. People began to see that this was not a construction, but a transformation. The earth itself was being rewritten. The marshes took shape. The trees were cleared not in chaos, but in rings. Fire pits were placed with consideration to wind, smoke, and visibility to the stars. Every night, the flickering flames formed constellations on the land that mirrored those above. This was the beginning of the city as a map of the cosmos. But Ahkuun did not stop at symmetry. He began to order the creation of open spaces, plazas designed not for habitation, but for ceremony. At the center of one, a circular pit was dug and filled with water. During the equinox, the rising sun passed directly through the eastern causeway and struck the pool. Each new structure was born from alignment of sun, wind, water, shadow. There were no arbitrary walls. Every stone laid, every trench dug, carried purpose beyond the physical. And in that design, the people began to change. They no longer feared the river. They studied it. They no longer fled the storms. They listened to them. They no longer asked the gods for favors. They built places for the gods to walk among them. And all the while, Ahkuun moved through the growing city like a shadow with weight. He did not command. He adjusted. He guided. His power was not the loud kind but the gravitational kind. Around him, order formed. Ix Chelna's role grew equally vital. She formalized the glyph system they had once scribbled on bark and clay. To interpret the spirals of wind, to calculate the distance between sound and echo. From her teachings, the first priest architects were born. They began to take over the practical elements of city building, allowing Ahkuun to retreat further into vision. He spent more time in silence, more time with his hands on the soil. Basalt, dense, heavy, black as midnight, too heavy for most to lift. It was said that the gods slept inside them. The stonecutters wept when they first saw the size. But Ahkuun simply touched the surface and whispered, "It remembers." The first colossal block was not carved immediately. It was placed on a platform of red clay and left there under the sun for 3 cycles. Only after it had absorbed the heat, the rain, the wind, did the carving begin. It was not the image of a man, but of an ancestor, a hybrid of jaguar and human, crowned with glyphs. The head alone stood taller than a man. His face was neither cruel nor kind. It was knowing. When it was completed, it was placed at the northern gate of the city, not as a guardian but as a witness. Others followed, each unique, each bearing subtle features, wide noses, strong jaws, distinct helmets. Some believed they were rulers. Others said they were warriors or gods or stars. Ahkuun said nothing. He allowed the people to wonder. In their uncertainty, reverence grew. Soon, San Lorenzo became more than a city. It became a story told in stone. Travelers arrived from distant regions, some out of curiosity, others in search of blessing. They came with offerings. Cacao. With the influx came change. New languages, new rituals, new questions. And beneath it all, the old world, the world of scattered tribes and isolated settlements, began to dissolve. A network formed. Not an empire, not yet, but a rhythm, a shared pulse. Ahkuun watched it unfold like a seed bursting through soil. He had not asked for it, but he had made it inevitable. In private, he walked the line of breath again. It remained intact, preserved under a canopy of woven branches. He stood there one evening, long after the sun had set, listening. The earth was quieter now. The wind softer. The soil still warm. Ix Chelna found him there. She said only, "It has begun." He nodded, but his eyes were distant, because beneath the satisfaction of creation, beneath the wonder of rising stone and flowering glyph, there was unease. He had built a city from mud and memory. He had reshaped the wild. He had brought order to the storm, but he had also created a beacon, and in the darkness beyond the rivers, something was watching, something ancient, something that did not fear cities. The stone arrived in silence as it always did, pulled from the belly of distant hills, floated across swollen rivers lashed by wind and heat. It arrived in the city like a sacred animal returning to its den. These were not random blocks. They were chosen, hand-selected by men whose eyes had been trained to see not just weight, but memory, to sense not just hardness but willingness. The basalt was dark and coarse, each piece holding a coldness even under sun. When the sculptors touched the stone for the first time, they did not measure or mark. They placed their palms flat, pressed their faces close, and listened. By the time the first heads were carved, the city had already begun to shift beneath the weight of its own story. The plazas no longer simply aligned with constellations, they echoed with chants. The shrines no longer merely honored rain, they demanded precision, perfection. And Ahkuun, once a boy who heard the earth breathe, had become something else entirely. He no longer spoke in gatherings. His presence was enough. He no longer corrected builders. They built what they believed he would imagine. He no longer had to teach. His silence had become doctrine. But the stone was different. It did not yield to silence. It required conversation. So when Ahkuun ordered the first image to be carved, he did not issue a decree. He simply stood beside the newest monolith and drew in the dirt with a stick of charred wood. It was a face. Angular, stern, eyes closed, mouth neutral. Not a likeness of himself, nor of any known man. It was something else. Composite. A being that might have been man once now passed through something older. The sculptors studied the sketch. They asked no questions. Work began before dawn. They moved with reverence, not out of fear, but anticipation. The process was slow, painful, ritualistic. Every blow of the hammerstone was followed by breath. Every chisel mark was matched by song. Sculpting in San Lorenzo had become more than craft. It was communion. Ahkuun watched but never intervened. He visited the site each morning before the sun rose, placed his hand on the base of the block and walked away. He never stayed long enough to see the form emerge. And still it did. Cheeks took shape. Brows thickened. The mouth flattened into an expression that was neither joy nor rage. As the days passed, the sculpture grew not just in detail but in presence. Then came the moment of revelation. When the stone was lifted upright, still raw, unfinished, unpainted, people gathered around it in absolute silence. It was not a statue. It was not an idol. It was a memory, frozen in basalt. A creature between time and breath. A witness to something none could name. Children stared. Elders wept. Even the wind seemed to quiet. It was then that the city changed again. The head was placed not in a temple, nor on a platform. It stood in the middle of the eastern causeway, where it faced the rising sun each morning. On the equinox, the first light of day touched its crown, ran down its cheeks, and pooled at the base. This was not design. This was destiny. After that, more heads followed. Each was unique, some wider, some taller, some smoother, some lined with deep, mysterious ridges. Some wore what looked like helmets. Others had patterns around the mouth. None bore names. None claimed to be anyone in particular. Yet everyone saw something familiar in them. A cousin. A warrior. A forgotten dream. A fear. The sculptors did not work alone. Every carving became a communal rite. Children brought water. Women mixed pigments to stain the surrounding clay. Elders burned herbs to guide the spirits trapped in stone. And Ahkuun, always watching, rarely speaking, would mark the completion of each monument with a simple gesture. A spiral drawn in the air, then pressed to his chest. Ix Chelna recorded every sculpture. She catalogued them not by date or dimension, but by event. The first rain after drought. The night the river bled. The eclipse without warning. She believed each stone captured a moment, not a man. That the heads were not tributes, but anchors, binding the city's soul to the flow of time. As years passed, the landscape of San Lorenzo transformed again. No longer just platforms and walkways, no longer only plazas and shrines, the city became a gallery of silence. The heads stood in ritual formations, forming sightlines and shadow paths. At noon, their faces disappeared in blinding contrast. At twilight, their eyes seemed to follow the last rays of sun. During storms, water pooled at their bases, reflecting their heavy features as if the gods themselves were watching. Travelers began to arrive not in curiosity, but in pilgrimage. They carried offerings, obsidian blades, turtle shells, rare cacao, even jade, hoping to place them at the feet of the stone witnesses. They whispered prayers, not knowing if the heads heard, or even if they could. But belief had taken root, and belief is heavier than stone. One day, a man from the western mountains brought with him a small child, no older than 6, with eyes pale as smoke. The man had walked for 13 days, following rivers and stars. When he arrived, he did not speak. He simply placed the child before the largest head, bowed and walked away. The child remained. No one asked who he was. He was given food, taught glyphs, and allowed to wander. Eventually, he began speaking to the heads, not with words but with gestures, mimicking their mouths, tracing their brows, pressing his small forehead to their base. The sculptors watched in silence. When Ahkuun passed him in the plaza, he stopped for the first time in days, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and nodded. The city grew even more intricate. New heads were carved with more abstract features. Some bore jaguar ears. Others had crocodile eyes. A few showed closed mouths twisted in half-smiles or open in silent screams. These were not portraits. These were gods, not as perfect beings, but as truths, wild, unknowable, essential. Ix Chelna began to worry, not for the stone but for the people. They were no longer simply remembering, they were worshipping. The heads became shrines. Offerings multiplied. Some began to believe the heads could answer questions, cure illness, grant visions. She watched as a mother, in desperation, rubbed her infant's forehead against the basalt and whispered, "Give him breath." Ahkuun did not stop them. He watched, because deep within him, he knew what Ix Chelna also feared. That power, once externalized, becomes hungry. That a symbol, once sculpted, can grow fangs. He returned to the quarry one day alone. There, among the remnants of unshaped stone, he found a block larger than any before. He ordered it moved immediately with no ceremony. The sculptors hesitated it would take weeks, but they obeyed. When it arrived in San Lorenzo, Ahkuun cleared the central plaza. He declared that no one was to touch the stone. For 13 days, it sat in silence. On the 14th, Ahkuun began to carve. He did not eat. He did not sleep among the people. He carved alone, without audience, using tools none had seen before, chisels of sharpened bone, hammers of fossilized wood. The work was not beautiful. It was brutal, aggressive, primal. At night, he covered the stone with woven mats. No one saw its progress. Only Ix Chelna was allowed near. When it was finished, Ahkuun unveiled it at dawn. The head was different from all others. Its eyes were wide open, its mouth slightly parted. Its features were unmistakably human, unmistakably worn, unmistakably his. There was no ceremony, no music, just stillness. The people did not cheer. They did not bow. They stood frozen, because in that moment they understood. Ahkuun had not sculpted himself. He had sculpted his disappearance. It was a warning, promise, farewell. The god was man, and the man was leaving. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, because the stone, like the river, always remembers, and sometimes the only way to live forever is to vanish. She was never crowned, never robed in gold or adorned in feathers meant for queens. No procession ever hailed her name, and no child was taught to chant her lineage. But without her, the city would not have remembered how to breathe. Without her, the stones would have stood mute, and the glyphs would have lost their meaning. In the shadow of the Jaguar King, she moved not in silence, but in the hum of wind between symbols, in the echo between words not spoken aloud. Ix Chelna, the one they called the Sky Scribe, had become more than a priestess, more than a companion, more than a witness. She had become the memory behind the vision. While Ahkuun built with stone and silence, Ix Chelna built with rhythm. In a city increasingly shaped by monument and mystery, she carved clarity. She taught not the what but the why. To her students she gave not answers but tools. A spiral is not just a line, she told them. It is a breath drawn inward or outward depending on the direction of the hand. A glyph is not a word, it is a moment, a weight, a turning. And numbers, those sacred steps between order and chaos, are not for counting. They are for knowing when to begin again. In her sanctuary, neither temple nor school, but something between, she recorded the city's pulse. She marked the days not in moon phases alone, but in the shifts of shadow across stone heads, in the silences between rainstorms, in the moments when birds paused in their calls for no reason. Her scrolls were not scrolls. They were bark, shell, fabric, clay, whatever the world would take ink upon. She wove knowledge into rope. She etched wind into pottery. She painted thunder onto hides. And through it all, she watched Ahkuun drift further from the people, further even from her. He had never been entirely hers. She had known that since childhood. He belonged to something older, something wider. She did not claim him. She translated him. She tempered the fear that followed in his wake, turned it into understanding. When the city knelt before stone faces, it was she who reminded them that gods were not above, they were within. But even she could not ignore what was beginning to change. The glyphs had begun to echo themselves. She noticed it first in the ceremonial records, phrases repeating across unrelated events. The same signs for water and death appearing in opposite contexts. A harvest celebration marked with a symbol for thunderstorm. A naming rite duplicated glyphs from a funeral. First, she thought it was error. Then she realized it was rhythm. The city was looping. The pattern was folding in on itself. This was not architecture. It was prophecy. She brought her findings to Ahkuun, unrolled the layered fabric scroll across the length of the central altar. He studied it with his fingertips, not his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was not surprised. "It begins," he said. He had seen it too. The city had reached the edge of its cycle, not its end, but the point at which things change irrevocably. She did not ask what form the change would take. She already felt it in her bones. The rains had grown erratic, not absent, but confused. They came in violent bursts, then vanished for weeks. Birds migrated early. Trees bloomed late. The river, once their clock, had begun to stutter. Fish patterns reversed. Insects bred outside their moons. Nature was no longer responding to the glyphs. It was unlearning them. Ix Chelna ordered her students to double their records. She expanded the observatory, dug new channels to capture sound, stationed listeners in high towers and deep wells. They charted wind like language. They plotted silence like terrain. And what they found disturbed them. The earth was no longer just shifting, it was warning. Deep beneath the city, tremors began. Soft at first, like the purring of a jaguar behind thick leaves. Then stronger. Not enough to crack stone, but enough to shake water from bowls. The elders said it was memory, rising. The young said it was punishment, coming. Ahkuun, meanwhile, turned his focus inward. He spoke less, peered less. He no longer walked the causeways at dawn. He no longer met visitors. The heads kept watch in his place. He remained in the heart of the city, in a chamber of his own making, part tomb, part listening vessel. Ix Chelna knew what he was doing. He was trying to hear beneath time, and she did not stop him. Instead, she began to prepare for his absence. Not for his death. She did not believe death could take him, but for the moment when he would step fully into the dream that had claimed him long ago. She trained a council, not of priests, but of translators, people who could carry meaning forward, not by preserving it perfectly, but by letting it evolve. She told them, "Do not protect the past. Carry it into the fire and reshape it." Then came the nights of no stars. 3 in succession. The sky black with cloudless emptiness. No moon, no light, just void. The people panicked. Infants refused to sleep. Dogs howled at nothing. The heads seemed to grow darker, heavier. Some swore they changed positions when no one watched. Others claimed to hear breathing beneath the plaza. Ix Chelna stood in the center of the eye of time and did not move for 3 nights. She waited. She chanted. She remembered. On the 4th dawn, the sun returned. But so did something else. A disease of the wind. The city smelled wrong. Metallic, hot, sour. The birds did not sing. The river lost its taste. Fish floated dead, without wound. A dust settled over the eastern causeway, red, fine like crushed clay. Ix Chelna ordered the burning of the outer ring. Not in panic, but in control. She knew what had to be done. Disease is memory misplaced. Fire would teach the city how to forget. And so the fires rose. Not wild, not cruel cleansing. The air cleared. The dead fish ceased. But the people did not forget. They remembered the stillness, the weight, the way the heads had watched but not wept. Faith turned brittle. Some demanded new gods. Some blamed Ahkuun. Some looked to Ix Chelna, and she bore it. Because even gods need shadows to walk in. Then, one morning, she found the chamber empty. No sign of struggle. No trace of departure. Just a single glyph drawn in ash on the wall. A spiral, split in 2. He had left. Whether into the earth, into the river, or into the dream, she did not know. But she did not cry. She sat on the stone where he used to stand and listened. The city did not speak. The earth did not stir. The heads remained silent. And she understood. This was her moment. Not to replace him, but to carry the silence forward. She gathered the council. She sealed the chamber. She decreed the glyph forbidden. Not out of fear, but reverence. Then she walked the line of breath alone one final time. Each step echoed not into the past, but into what came next. Because the Queen of Shadows was not made of crown or stone. She was made of rhythm, of silence measured, of memory held just long enough to let go. And as the rains returned, not in storms, but in steady song, the city learned to breathe again. But beneath its foundations, something shifted. A breath held. A claw retracted. The jaguar would wake again. But not yet. Not while she remembered. Now turned to pale gold too early. The stalks whispered to one another in dry, rasping voices. At first, no one noticed. The city had seen dry weeks before. The river's moods were as familiar as the breath of sleep. But this was different. The rain did not retreat. It vanished. Days passed. Then weeks. The clouds gathered only to scatter without gift. The air thickened with dust. Pools once used for stargazing cracked at their rims. The canals grew sluggish, their surface scummed with floating debris. The people murmured, not yet in fear, but in confusion. They still believed. They still trusted the glyphs carved in stone, the heads staring eastward, the great circles laid by those who had heard the voice of the earth. But the signs had shifted. Ix Chelna felt it first in the tone of the wind. It no longer carried the scent of wet leaves or distant thunder. It was sharp, metallic, scented with heat and old bark. Now it loomed like a question carved too deep into stone. The people looked to Ix Chelna for answers, but her voice had grown hoarse from reciting prayers that no longer landed. She still walked the line of breath, still traced the moon's arc with blackened shells, still listened at the mouth of the wind tower. But what she heard was a stutter, a rhythm broken by something just beyond understanding. The harvest failed. The maize dried before its kernels could fill. Beans withered on the vine. The fish retreated or died. Wells sank lower than they ever had. And the people, who had once worshipped heads of stone and spirals of thought, began to whisper among themselves again. The old gods, they said, had turned their backs. Perhaps it was the heads themselves, so still, so heavy, drawing life away like leeches on the skin of the land. Some broke into the sealed chamber, where Ahkuun had vanished. They found nothing but dust and spirals on the wall, and the spiral was split. A drought does not simply kill by thirst, kills by doubt. It dries the bond between people faster than it dries the soil. Neighbors hoarded water. Families blocked off cisterns. Ix Chelna ordered them cleaned, but her hand trembled. She stood before the council, once vibrant with minds of vision and balance, now shrunk into factions of caution and despair. They threw stones at their bases. One morning, the smallest head, one carved by a child apprentice years ago, was found toppled, its jaw broken, its base cracked. It was the first time stone had bled. Ix Chelna did not speak at its funeral. She simply buried its fragments in a ring of ash and maize husk, and ordered the plaza where it had stood to be left empty. No more statues were carved, not out of cruelty, but to save strength. Ix Chelna fasted with the people. She stood before the broken cisterns and lifted her arms toward the jaguar constellation above, now barely visible in the dust-stained sky. And still nothing. The ground cracked. The city, once built on water's back, now settled deeper into the ache of thirst. The great pools of reflection became beds of white dust. The canals turned to lines of broken shell. The spiral, the city's breath, now turned inward, suffocating itself. Eyes glowing like the sun, that he held in his hand a jaguar skull, and in its mouth, the rain waited. Others said he had become stone, buried beneath the largest head. In the spiral lines etched across forgotten bricks, something remained, waiting for the rain to remember how to fall. They came first as shadows on the horizon, not as warriors, not yet, but as figures moving against the pale light of a broken dawn. Their footsteps stirred no dust, for they walked not across desert but through mist, the coastal fog that clung to the lowlands even as the rains refused to return. To the people of San Lorenzo, who had come to fear silence more than thunder, these shapes looked like ghosts. But ghosts do not carry spears. Ghosts do not march in lines. Rumors arrived before they did. Traders who had once moved freely between the scattered villages and ports now spoke of cities beyond the eastern marshes. Places where the rains had not failed, where green still grew, and where new rulers had risen, clothed in shell and fire. These rulers did not speak in glyphs. They did not read spirals. They wore no jaguar pelts and burned no offerings beneath stone heads. They were something else, and they were coming. San Lorenzo had once been a beacon, an axis around which the known world bent. Its plazas had been maps, its monuments the anchors of memory. But now, the spiral lay fractured. The heads were broken or buried or worse, ignored. The canals had run dry, and the once ordered hum of daily ritual had collapsed into murmurs of hunger and doubt. The people no longer looked to the sky. They looked to the east. The invaders were not numerous. They did not need to be. Their presence was not a flood. It was a needle. Their weapons were flaked obsidian, sharper than anything the sculptors of San Lorenzo had ever shaped. Their tunics were layered with strange metals, beaten thin and worn with salt. Their faces were painted with crimson stripes that cut across the nose and mouth, as if to mark where voice ended and action began. And most terrifying of all, they did not speak. Others claimed she had become one with the wind, that her voice now spoke only to those who still walked the line of breath. But no one walked the line now. The plaza where it began had been trampled, its stones pried loose and taken by the invaders for reasons no one understood. In the heart of the city, where the largest head once watched the sun rise, a new structure appeared. It was not made of basalt or carved with reverence. It was a scaffold quickly raised, lashed with cord and bone. From its center hung banners marked with foreign marks. Atop it stood a man, not young, not old, whose chest bore scarification in the shape of an inverted hand. He spoke for the first time in a language none recognized. But the meaning was clear. San Lorenzo would not be destroyed. It would be absorbed. The spiral would not be broken. It would be overwritten. Resistance came not from warriors, for there were none left. Came in the form of memory. In the darkest corners of the city, those who remembered the chants began to whisper them again. The old glyphs were painted on walls in ash. Bowls were left in hidden places filled with water. Guttural howl that twisted through the stone ruins and shook the scaffold at its bolts. The sky, long silent, split with lightning. But there was no rain, only light, heat, and sound. In the center of the eastern plaza, the air shimmered, and the earth opened. It did not gape wide. It did not roar. It breathed. A thin column of dust rose in a perfect spiral, spinning slow and deliberate. From its center came the faintest rumble, not of rock, but of voice. The heads trembled. The largest of them, half buried near the southern wall, cracked down its center. Inside was not stone. It was hollow, and within it ash. The invaders pulled back, disturbed not by weapon or army, but by the unknown. They had not come for battle. They had come for dominance. But the city did not surrender. It did not cry out. It responded as it always had, with memory. From the broken spiral of the plaza, shoots of green emerged. Small but defiant. Not maize. Something older. Plant no one could name. It grew in the shape of a curve. A whisper spread. The earth remembered. The invaders tried to stamp it out. They burned the green. They carved deeper. But the more they tried, the more the city shifted. Pathways once solid gave way to mud. Walls leaned. Sounds echoed wrong. Children cried for no reason. The air thickened, and dreams returned. The people began to see him again, Ahkuun, not as a man, as shadow, as shape, as rhythm. In the cracks between stones, in the eyes of the last sculpted head, in the pattern of falling dust. And beneath its soil, the spiral continued to turn, waiting. Like the wearing away of a name carved in soft wood. San Lorenzo was not destroyed. It was exhausted. The rains had not returned. The invaders had pulled back. The heads remained, but cracked, leaning, covered in moss that sprouted from wounds time had not yet sealed. And in the absence of leaders, of priestesses, of builders and dreamers, only story remained. Story, and the faint suggestion that something still lived beneath it all. The elders whispered of Ahkuun not as a man now, but as a possibility. They said he had carved not cities but doors. That every platform he laid was not for standing upon, but for descending through. They said he had not disappeared. He had folded himself inward, into the stone, into the water. So too would the king. For a time the city was forgotten. It sank, not beneath mud, but beneath irrelevance. The trade routes shifted. New cities rose. New glyphs took shape. Elsewhere, rulers stood on altars of lime and jade. Elsewhere, heads were carved with grins instead of silence. The spiral faded from language, from memory, from skin. But it did not fade from the stone. Beneath the center of the plaza, under layers of ash and fallen brick, there remained a vault. Not a tomb, a chamber, known only to those who had once knelt before Ix Chelna and drawn their breath through her spiral-shaped shell. In that chamber lay the final stone, not a head, not a statue, a shape unfinished, a body not yet formed. The glyphs called it Ahkuun, the waiting stone. No one touched it, but one night a child did. She was not meant to be there. Her mother had led her away from the city's center, away from the voices and the crumbling walls. But the girl had wandered, drawn by something she could not name. The wind had turned strange, cool, then warm, then still. She stepped across the broken plaza without fear. The moon cast no shadow. The vault opened with ease. Inside, she did not scream. She did not kneel. She walked to the center, placed her hand upon the stone, and whispered, "You're still here." No one taught her those words. The next morning the wind returned, and with it, rain. Fell soft at first, like memory finding its breath. Then stronger. The cracked canals shivered. Dust became mud. Old seeds stirred. Birds called out names they had forgotten. and the heads, heavy with years of silence. He had built to disappear, not to dominate. He had carved his own erasure. In doing so, he had made space for others to listen, to remember, to breathe. The city had risen under his vision, but it had survived by letting him go. Some say he was buried beneath the largest head, where the glyph split in two. Others claim his body was never real, that he was the echo of a god remembering how to walk. A few believe he still waits, not beneath the earth, but within it, as pulse, as rhythm, as the memory of balance. And the heads, though silent, still listen. They are not gods. They are reminders of a city built not from conquest, but from alignment, of a ruler who did not speak often, but when he did, made the earth pause. It was a closing of the spiral, not with sorrow, with breath. And as the rains returned, hesitant and sacred, the broken pools filled again. The children danced in them, tracing lines in the mud that curved and turned without knowing why. The old glyphs, half erased, shimmered beneath moss and lichen, and the stone heads watched, as they always had. The jungle returned first, quietly as it always does, not in conquest but in persistence. Vines crept over what was once a plaza. Moss softened the contours of causeways that had once directed the footsteps of a people aligned with the sky. Trees rose through stone, not to destroy, but to remind. The city of San Lorenzo did not crumble. It was embraced, wrapped in green and shade, hidden not by disaster, but by rhythm. Centuries passed. The names changed. The maps redrew. Then came the men with shovels and notebooks. They did not speak the language of the spiral. They spoke of excavation, of chronology, of typology and core samples. They saw not a city but a site. They uncovered heads first, massive, brooding, inexplicable. Faces carved with tools they did not yet understand. Helmets adorned with symbols no record could translate. The heads did not yield their secrets. They stared, as they always had, into the dawn. One by one, more fragments emerged. Plazas, platforms, drained canals. Carvings of jaguars with human eyes. Like vines seeking sun. But the spiral refused to fit. No written language matched its patterns. No known calendar explained its turns. The logic was not linear. It was breath. And breath is not easily catalogued. They labeled it San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan, the name of a village layered atop the ruins. They dated the heads. They mapped the site. They published papers. But still, they did not know who had stood here, who had traced the first trench into the mud, who had listened to the silence between storms and heard the voice of the earth, until they found the vault. It was not marked. It was not guarded. It revealed itself after a heavy rain, when a section of ground collapsed near the southern edge of the central mound. First, they believed it a reservoir until they descended. Inside were no offerings, no bones, no gold. Only walls etched with spirals, floor to ceiling. At the center, a single stone slab. Smooth, unfinished, unmoved. They called it a monument. They placed lights around it, took photographs, ran their fingers across its surface, noting the absence of tool marks, the density of the basalt. It was unlike anything else in the region. Some speculated it had religious significance. Others thought it might be a throne. But when the storm returned, unexpected, fierce, electric, the slab resonated. A low hum, deep and vibrating. The air changed. The researchers evacuated the chamber, not out of fear, but instinct. They could not explain what they felt. The sound was not audible in the traditional sense. It was felt in the chest, in the bones, in the breath. A spiral turned, then faded. They never returned to the vault. Instead, they sealed it. Tourists came to see them. Children posed beside them, oblivious to the weight of centuries behind those stone eyes. Guides spoke of early kings, of Olmec myths, of lost cities. They spoke of influence, of trade routes, of artistry, but not of Ahkuun, because his name had never been carved. His face had never been signed. His spiral had never been owned. He had passed through time not as ruler, but as echo. And the echo remained. In the way light fell through broken ceilings. In the way water pooled in cracks shaped like breath. In the way silence followed the wind after the last footstep left the plaza. Some nights the air still shifts, not in temperature but in rhythm. And those who listen closely, those who place their hands upon the stone, not to measure, but to remember, they hear it, turning, a breath, not of the past, but of something always present. Because the spiral is not memory, it is continuity, and beneath the jungle, beneath the stone, beneath the weight of forgetting, San Lorenzo still breathes, and the Jaguar King still watches, not from above, but from within.